Hey, happy Monday afternoon. Dr. Alan Christensen here with you for Office Hours Live. If you've been here before with me, welcome back. If you're new, this is Office Hours. So I'll always have a few things queued up to talk about, and then I'll grab a bunch of your top questions. I'm with you guys right now on a couple of platforms. We are on YouTube Live, we are on Facebook Live, we're on Instagram Live, and there's one or two more as well. So Uh, and I'm seeing you guys come on. Welcome. A lot of folks are here already with us. So good to see you all. Put in your questions, your key topics. Topics are going to include thyroid disease, Hashimoto's, Graves' disease, nodules. Those are some big ones that come up. But yeah, any thyroid topic, endocrine topics. So managing blood sugar, body weight, hormone replacement type topics. So those are all the big ones I'd love to go deep with you guys on. And my bias in doing these is that you can Google anything and find some just off the cuff generic answers, but I want you to get stuff that's useful and more specific. And you want to get deeper complexity, more relatable, more specific to your needs. So that's what we're up to. Uh, Alina Rose is with us. Hey there, how you doing? So yeah, YouTube, Facebook, we're on several different platforms. Thyroidectomy, interest in thyroidectomy. So that's a great one. And in terms of other things that are going on, so I always like to give a couple of announcements if there's big events taking place. Joanne's with us. Happy Monday to you too, Joanne. We're doing a webinar series right now, and these are free webinars. They're in-depth topics about key concerns of thyroid function. And the occasion is that we've got a brand new line of personalized thyroid products that have come out. Personalized, well, thyroid specific, I should say. It's a better way of saying it. So, yeah, it's never been done before. There's never been supplements made from scratch just for thyroid disease, if you can believe that. There's a handful of thyroid support formulas on the market. Most were formulated back in the 80s and the 90s, and there's so much new good data. So I wanted to share the information about how to use these, but really make it just useful in general. So, for example, tomorrow night we'll talk about hyperthyroidism. And there's a new blend that's hyperthyroid support. I'll explain that, but I'll also talk about an overview of hyperthyroidism and what it is, why there's risks from that, where that starts. And I was going to touch on just one or two of those topics tonight as well, because this is a super important thing. So that's what's going on. We got these webinars happening, and they're also, you can see the archives of the past ones. Last week we did the thyroid nodules. We talked in real good depth about that one. And next week we're talking about sleep and the relevance of sleep and thyroid disease. So funny thing, it turns out the thyroid gland also secretes melatonin. Did you guys know that before? That was kind of a surprising thing for many. But I'll talk a lot about the ways in which they connect and collaborate. And there's some solutions based upon that haven't been put to use before. So yeah, next week is about sleep. This week, as in tomorrow evening, is about hyperthyroidism. And I will get links available about how to sign up for these. And once you are signed up for the webinar series, you're good to go. You'll get notices, and the same link will work for the future events. And I think we've got like 9 total queued up. And tomorrow is number 3 out of 9. They're free, and just want to give you guys some useful information. So I'm seeing some really cool stuff popping up already. And I had just a few points I was going to mention about hyperthyroidism. Let me just briefly talk about who this might be for. So tomorrow's talk on hyperthyroidism. I'm thinking about this for a couple of real different audiences. One of which are those, and you might not have thought of this before, but those on medications that have you at a hyperthyroid state, meaning your TSH is low and or your free hormones are elevated. So if your blood tests say you're getting too much, even if it's just that TSH being below range, this talk is really for you. Now, if you have hyperthyroidism from yourself, from your body making too much, this is also for you. So that's primarily Graves' disease and toxic nodular goiter, toxic nodular, toxic multinodular goiter. So yeah, if you got too much thyroid hormone one way or another, this talk is for you. In the medical world, we say that as endogenous from from inside the body versus exogenous from outside the body. So exogenous hyperthyroidism is someone just taking a higher dose than their body would need, would otherwise make. And then endogenous is they're making too much. But yeah, both of those topics are going to be relevant for tomorrow night. So that was a big point I wanted to talk about. So I'm seeing some really, really good questions here coming in already, and I'll start just diving in on these. Tonight, I'll be with you guys for probably 30, 45 minutes. I'm going to go easy on my voice. I've got plenty of that for tomorrow night. Tomorrow's talk will be a bit longer, and I'll grab some live Q&A. The cool thing about those is I'll be on Zoom, and you can join me directly on Zoom. And when we get to Q&A, we cover most if not all the questions that come up, and we do a live video talk. So the group is there, but then one person can come on and unmute and share their question, and they and I can have a good detailed conversation about that. And again, that's so much more useful than just basic, quick, off the cuff, simple stuff. So seeing interest here and seeing some topics come up, and I'm looking right now on, I'm seeing the questions are showing up on Instagram, on Facebook, and on YouTube. So one was about thyroidectomy. Love your website. Thank you for that. Someone just made a comment. Oh, missed how to join the webinars. Yeah, Amy, I will have that link up right when I'm done. Where can I point you at that? I'm pretty sure if you go to drchristiansen.com, we've got it available there right now on the various sliders that show up. So yeah, drchristiansen.com. But I'll get that up on all these platforms by the time I'm done if it's not up sooner. So yeah, and you can sign up and it's free. Parathyroid guru. That's fascinating. A very niche topic, but a super important one. Parathyroid disease is often underdiagnosed and huge source of symptoms for a lot of people. So yeah, good to have you with, and thank you for any insights. And I saw one comment or just a question about thyroidectomy, and I'm guessing the person just wanted some more insights about how to manage that. So thyroidectomy, we got Heme, partial, like half thyroidectomy, or total thyroidectomy. And the thyroid itself, it's of course making thyroid hormones, but in its structural relationship, we also have it adjoining the parathyroids. And then we have the recurrent laryngeal nerves that pass through it. Kind of a funny thing, but the recurrent laryngeal nerves allow me to speak right now. They allow my brain and my tongue to connect. Oh, Matcha Lava's with us too. Hey there, how you doing today? And the recurrent laryngeal nerve, say that 10 times fast, it goes from your brain to your tongue, and it goes down quite a ways through your cavity, chest cavity, through your sternum, and around your thyroid, and then to your tongue. So it takes the long way to get there. So the relevance of that is there can be times to where that's damaged with thyroidectomy. And that's a reason why you want a surgeon that has a lot of volume, that does these things quite a bit. In the hands of a good surgeon, those risks are quite low. The other main one would be parathyroid. We just saw someone had a username relative to parathyroid something. But yeah, the parathyroids can become injured with thyroidectomy as well. And in those cases, calcium metabolism is disrupted. Past that, then the main thought is compensating for the lack of thyroid hormones. Now, the thyroid makes T4 and T3, and also T2 is produced. And the body has a need for all of those. And there are people, when their thyroid is removed, who can take T4 only, and they can do okay. They can make all those other hormones out of it. But a lot of people can't. A lot of folks just don't do their best unless they get more of a full spectrum of hormones. Now, when someone lacks a thyroid, kind of a counterintuitive thing is that they tend not to need a lot of medication adjustments. When someone's medications change, what's going on is what their body requires plus what they're currently making from their own thyroid, that's changing. And our body's physiologic requirements don't change all that much throughout adulthood. So most of the change that happens when someone needs a medication adjustment is because their thyroid is making more or less. And so the dose has to compensate for that. But if someone lacks a thyroid, what they make will not change. They're making zero. And so their dose will be a 100% compensation. So someone who lacks a thyroid, when they get on a type and an amount that works well for them, they're not going to have as many fluctuations as someone else would, which is not always expected. But yeah, they'll be on a dose that's higher. But if their dose is one that's appropriate for them, no big drawbacks to that. Now, with thyroid disease, I've talked a lot about iodine, and there's 3 big pillars I think about in terms of getting someone to feel at least as good as they did before thyroid disease emerged. And one of which is having iodine at the appropriate amounts. Now, someone who has a thyroid, regulating iodine may help their thyroid make more hormone. That's an obvious motivation for that. Someone who does not have a thyroid, well, they're not going to make more hormone. They're going to make none, and that's not going to change. But even apart from what your body's doing by itself, iodine can make your body resistant to thyroid hormone. So apart from what your thyroid does, it can make your cells numb and not respond as much to thyroid as they would have otherwise. So even if you lack a thyroid and you're on a total replacement dose, you can get more benefit from that in a state in which your body has not too much iodine, appropriate amounts. So that's still worth considering. Next, we think about, in a case like that, having your blood levels look like they would look in healthy people. Now, the normal range that we have, it's funny because normal range is very different for TSH, T3, T4, all the other markers. TSH is the one to where this is more of a factor than the others. For the TSH, normal range is not the same as healthy variance, right? So healthy people, their variance for TSH is narrower and lower than the normal range. It's not below the normal range, but it's lower than the high end of that. So most normal ranges are between about 0.4 and 4.5. But the healthy variance of TSH is probably more like 0.4 to 1.5, 1.9, some variation there. So healthy variation is not the same as normal average variation on the lab results. For T3 and T4, there's a very different story. In those cases, normal on the labs pretty much is normal variation in healthy people. But TSH is different. So if you lack a thyroid, you want to be sure that your scores look like they would look in healthy people, that healthy variation, not just normal variation. And the last big thing is what I call the co-morbidities, the other conditions. I've listed out 15 different conditions that afflict each one at least 5% or more of people with thyroid disease. Some are as common as 84%, like for latent iron depletion. But many people that have thyroid disease, they could do everything just right in terms of their medication, their iodine. And if they still struggle, it's not because those things weren't done well enough. It's because some other condition is affecting them. So those are the big three things to think through. And the diet, the iodine, I talked about those in great detail in the Thyroid Reset diet. I've got some posts talking about the optimal thyroid levels, and then more topics I have put out and will put out about those comorbidities. So that's a long answer about just the comment of total thyroidectomy, but those are the big things to think about to get back to your best health if you're not there already. When I saw a little bit more, okay, so Alina, do you know anything about the impact of coleus for scoliae on thyroid? Thank you. So Alina, uh, thank you for that. Yeah, good question. And this is funny. I mentioned a bit before about how there's like thyroid support products, and like every big company has a thyroid support product, and about 80% of them have coleus for scoliae in there. Now, this is the thing, this makes me nuts. These products were pretty much formulated, like I said, back in the 80s, and there were a few animal studies or a few test tube studies about various nutrients and what they may or may not do to the thyroid. Coleus for scoliae was one of those. Now, chemically, it's a cyclic ANP inhibitor, which makes one think that it could do all sorts of things theoretically. But the amount of forskolin, which is the active isolate in coleus for scoliae, is quite small. So if it did do if it was pure forskolin, even small doses could be fatal. They could do all kinds of bizarre things, but it lacks almost completely much of the active ingredient. There were some animal studies suggesting that forskolin could heighten the T4 to T3 conversion. And these were old studies from the 90s, and they were done on mice. And there was one study done on just cells in a test tube. And because of that, every thyroid support product out there has coleus for scoliae in there. Now, since then, in this last group of 5 to 10 years, there's been massive amounts of high quality, controlled human studies on various nutraceuticals, ones in which humans were given them and then meaningful things were tracked, like whether their nodules got bigger or not. And these studies that I'm referring to are also placebo studies. So we've got a lot of really good data saying that certain nutraceuticals can do helpful things, but that doesn't go into the typical thyroid support supplement. So yeah, they've all got choline for scoli. It doesn't really do anything. It's in the amounts that are used and the types that are used, which are almost devoid of forskolin. It doesn't really do anything good or bad. So yeah, no secret sauce. And yeah, the whole thyroid support, the general idea you would think is about helping to restore thyroid function. So in the case of thyroid specific formulations, you'd then think about antibody support. And that's one to reverse the whole autoimmune process, and lower antibodies help the thyroid increase its own output. And there's been a lot of large human studies showing that that stuff is all possible. And that's what that mixture is based upon. So another thing about this whole office hours live that you're joining me for is I love to have thematic discussions. So not just good detail on a question, but when questions relate to other questions, those are ones that I'll pay even the most attention to. Um, so yeah, I'm looking now for some follow-up questions and comments, and I'm seeing some already. Let me grab onto some of those. So I talked a bit about the comorbidities and iron levels. Here's a comment from YouTube as well. Thank you, and it's great to see you in great health. Yeah, thank you for that. I just talked to a dear friend before getting on this, someone I hadn't spoken to for months, and she and I hadn't spoken since I was sick in October. I had a meningoencephalitis secondary to West Nile virus, and I was on death's door for a little while, truth be told. And as I recovered, I had quite a while for which I really couldn't walk. I couldn't function. I slept 23 hours a day. And I never knew if, as I recovered, for all I knew, that at some point it might be this is as good as it gets, and this is how I'll be remaining. So it was pretty freaky. And I'm kind of realizing that there was just a lot of trauma and uncertainty and lack of control that I'm sorting out and processing. So thank you for that comment. It's good to be in. It's good to be in great health, and something I've always enjoyed, but even now I take that much less for granted. So to your question, optimal ranges of ferritin for a 48-year-old menstruating woman for longevity. So ferritin for longevity. So uh, we know a lot about high levels of ferritin being a drawback for oxidative stress. And the funny thing about ferritin is that it's important onto itself as a marker for iron, but like many other blood markers, it also tends to be inflated by a non-specific inflammatory response. So we know when someone has high levels of ferritin, they often will have worse overall health outcomes. And there are scenarios such as hereditary hemochromatosis, where someone genetically just holds on to iron and stores it. And we know that in those cases, there's a higher risk of early liver damage or kidney damage or things along those lines. But apart from actual iron overload, there are many states in which there's not really an iron overload, but a lot of iron is shifted into storage. So the total body burden of iron is fine, but there's too much in the wrong place. And in those cases, it's not really an excess of iron, it's just an inflammatory reaction. And those scenarios have many effects upon shortening lifespan. So they're not so much that iron is dangerous, but if someone has some other problem, it'll skew their ferritin. I won't go too much into this, but I just want to mention briefly the same thing is true of vitamin D, except for on the opposite end. So when people are ill, their vitamin D serum levels, they often drop. And before that was clear, many researchers were surprised. They were seeing like any health condition you could think of, there was worse outcomes when vitamin D was lower. And the logical thought was, oh, vitamin D must help with X and vitamin D must help with Y. And now we know, no, it's just that when you're sick, your serum vitamin D levels drop. Not because having low vitamin D made you sick, but just because so many illnesses cause your body to go into an acute phase reaction that changes your blood chemistry in some predictable ways, which can include elevating ferritin and lowering vitamin D. So in terms of for longevity, really just not being at a severe point of elevation or a severe deficiency. In terms of optimal health and symptoms, there's been data talking in a little more depth about thyroid disease specifically. So thyroid hormones are heme dependent. They require a certain amount of bioavailable iron, and many of the enzymes that metabolize and act upon thyroid hormones are also heme dependent. So even in a low optimal iron state, what happens there is that the body cannot work as well as far as responding to thyroid hormones. And that's a big reason why many with thyroid disease are symptomatic, even with what would otherwise be a more mild iron deficiency. And in terms of ferritin numbers, this is assuming that there's not other things driving ferritin or other abnormalities of the iron indices. But there's been published data showing that people with thyroid disease may have relevant iron deficient symptoms, even if their ferritin is somewhere below. Some sources suggest the 50s or 60s, some sources suggest as high as 100. So if your iron is even in the two digits and you've got thyroid disease and you've got unexplained hair loss or fatigue, that could be a factor. Now, no one is arguing ferritin should be higher than 150, 200, but when you're getting on that lower side of normal and you've got thyroid disease, it can be a big driver in symptoms. So, yeah. Okay. So I'm looking for follow-up discussion points here too. And I'm seeing one from Alina here, wondering if this, she asked about coleus for scoliae, wondering if this could make hypothyroid worse. I'm a big fan of black seed oil. Yeah, Alina, so black seed oil, AKA black cumin oil, I've used that in a lot of the thyroid-specific formulations. It's been well documented to lower thyroid antibodies, also increase thyroid hormone output, facilitate weight loss with thyroid disease. So it's useful in a lot of those various ways. And it's something that was used and is used as a food for millennia. So very safe thing, large range of doses, and really good quality evidence. I'm saying that it can help the thyroid do those things, that's based on double-blind, placebo-controlled human studies. So a large group of people that had thyroid disease were divided up, and everyone took pills. Half the pills had black cumin, half of them did not. And that basically showed that there was this difference in that there was more belly fat lost, there was lower antibody counts, there was increased thyroid hormone output, and one of these studies also showed changes in localized internal inflammation, meaning the thyroid was less apt to become precancerous. So very, very cool stuff and good evidence around that. So related, unable to order the Daily Reset bundle. Has this been taken off the website? I can see the Daily Reset packs. So the Daily Reset bundle would be on shop.thyroid. Let me get the exact URL. Shop.thyroidspecificformulations.com. It's not on the same website. So yeah, the thyroid specific formulations are on their own cart right now. In the course of the coming months, I have to undergo a lot of changes to get them onto the drchristiansen.com cart. But yeah, the drchristiansen.com shopping cart does have the Daily Reset pack. But if you were over on the shop.thyroidspecificformulations.com, that's where you can find the Daily Reset bundle. And that's the newer version of that. The Reset pack is great. The bundle is fewer pills, and it's a little more streamlined. So that's a perk about it. So I'm seeing some cool related questions. I'm going to dive on a few of these. Thank you, Dr. Christensen. I purchased your Easy Iron. Very hopeful it'll sort out the deficiency. I am so excited about Easy Iron, you guys. This is also on the new store, and these are shipping out within the next week. So they're on pre-order. They're coming out real quick. But Easy Iron, I'll have a whole webinar talking more about that in depth. This is going to be an awesome solution for iron deficiency and those that they've taken iron and their scores didn't get better, or they took it and they couldn't take it because it just tore up their tummy. It made them feel awful or constipated or digestive upset. So yeah, this is going to be a total game changer. There's good evidence about organic acids and also piperine making iron better absorbed and better tolerated. There's data about vitamin C, and some supplements have used that, which is great, but none have used the organic acids in piperine. And the data about that is so strong. We could see somewhere around 4 to 10 times the absorption and a tiny fraction of the digestive issues. So this would be a great thing for so many that have had unexplained hair loss or the fatigue or the insomnia or the headaches. There's a lot of ways in which low-grade iron deficiency is not good, and it can really be just devastating for people. And they've struggled trying to get it built up again, but the pills they took just didn't work, or if they took enough, they couldn't stay on them because it bothered their stomach too much. So here's a cool one from Todd. Is a plant-based diet bad for Hashimoto's? So here's the thing, you guys. If you take a look on published medical data on various diets and Hashimoto's, you'd be so surprised at how different the medical research is from what the popular discussions are. A lot of popular discussions do talk about a plant-based diet as being a bad thing in various ways, but the only data published about plant-based diets and Hashimoto's uh, show that those on plant-based diets have lower risk of developing the disease. And that's true for Hashimoto's, for hypothyroidism, and also for Graves' disease, that vegans are less apt to develop those. Now, in the thyroid reset diet, I talked a bit about that. So, kind of a puzzle I've had is that there have been studies about the autoimmune. There was a study about the autoimmune paleo protocol, and it showed really no changes to thyroid function from those who were on it were monitored. But many say they've done better from that. And similar story about gluten. Many say they've gone gluten free and it's been helpful. Totally fine. So far, the published studies have shown that apart from those with celiac, there's no big effects that going gluten free has on thyroid function. So, how could someone feel they do better on a paleo diet, but how can people also do better on a vegan diet or a gluten free diet? They're all different. And not only that, but the vegan and the paleo are pretty different. So, how could both those diets possibly be helpful when they're almost like opposite? And I mapped this out in the thyroid reset diet. So, all those diets that I just mentioned, they're all lower iodine diets. They're not trying to be. But so check this out. So a vegan diet, let me back up a step. Sorry. So the biggest sources of dietary iodine are going to be certain types of salt, dairy food, processed grains, not grains, but processed grains, eggs, seafood, and then sea vegetables. Then we've got the cosmetics as well and supplements, medications, but those are the big ones for foods. Now, if someone's vegan, well, the egg yolks are out, the dairy's out, the seafood's out, and most vegans are healthier in general. They're less apt to be on processed grains. So you're going to cut out a lot of those big sources. And now think about if someone's autoimmune paleo. Well, the processed grains are out, the dairy's out, the eggs are out, so they're also chopping down quite a bit on those big sources. And gluten-free, the processed grains are out. Many who are gluten-free are dairy-free. And those are the two biggest changed sources. So all the sources I mentioned, the last two, the dairy and the processed grains, those are the two that have changed in the last several decades. All the others have not. They've had iodine, it's been there, it's been a constant contribution. But the amount in dairy and the amount in processed grains has roughly tripled. One assay that I cited in the book looked at the top 25 dietary sources of iodine in the American diet. And many were the dairy and the processed grains. And 23 of the 25 have increased the amount in the last decade or more, and many have tripled. So if someone cut those foods out alone, they might improve their thyroid function. Not even because there was some inherent thing with dairy or gluten, just because they took their iodine intake so much lower. So no, a plant-based diet can be fine. And I think the biggest factor for the diet is really going to be the iodine content. So, published studies on diet and thyroid disease. We've got the two studies I mentioned on vegan diets and the risk of developing thyroid disease. There's one study on autoimmune paleo. There's one study on gluten that's not for celiac. And there's one study called the 1001 Dalmatian studies about ethnic Croatians and a variety of food categories. So we got these 5 studies, right? And now we've got about 27,000 studies on the impact of dietary iodine on thyroid disease. So all other things besides iodine is 5 studies. Iodine alone is 27,000 studies. So now you guys know why I put so much emphasis on that. That's what we know. That's what we know makes a big difference. Everything else has barely been studied. And even then, it showed that the effects were very small or nothing, that they didn't really do very much. So yeah, that's a huge factor. And your iodine is not the only factor for all facets of your health, not by any means. But as far as your thyroid's concerned, it just about is. So yeah, so a plant-based diet, if you're thinking about your micronutrients, your protein, the total context of that, you can do well from that. And some people more so than others, I would say. Personally, I resonate with the ethic and the environmental discussions towards that, but I fall in the category of those that don't do well without animal protein. And that's not everyone. Many people can do quite well, but not everyone can. I just saw someone join us. Josh, if you're with us, if you wouldn't mind putting a link in about the sign up for the webinar tomorrow night, someone asking about that. So yeah, on Instagram, that may pop up for you guys shortly. Let me grab one or two more related questions. I get to hang out with Josh tomorrow. That'll be fun. It's nice to see people in person these days because it's rather rare. Um, Related questions. Nori King is commenting ferritin lower limit of biennial, perhaps she meant normal, with high iron and iron saturation. Of normal, I meant, oh yeah, sure enough. Sure, so that would not be a low iron state. Yeah, iron indices really do take into account, in some cases, the blood count, many other liver markers. There can be a lot to really say why iron is in a certain place if there's less common pairings of the findings. So that would be a real more detailed issue, but that wouldn't be a straightforward iron deficiency in a scenario like that. That could be an inflammatory excess or any number of other things. Okay, let me grab one or two more. Oh, it's just a related question. So here's one. Ashwagandha is safe to take when you have diagnosis of Hashis. Yeah, so back to my I was saying before about the thyroid support supplements. One more brief aside about the thyroid support supplements and scare quotes. So one paper looked at supplements that were thyroid glandulars, that were ones that said, hey, this is thyroid tissue from cows, it's non-prescription, it's in a capsule. And a lot of those things say they don't have active thyroid hormones in them, but they do. One study, they bought these products and they brought them in the lab and they measured how much they had for active thyroid hormone, and they had a lot, and it was willy-nilly. One pill might have 100 micrograms of T4, the next one might have none. One pill might have 10 micrograms of T3 and 50 of T4. The next could have none. So they did have active hormone. There's no way they can really take that out, but there was no consistency in the amounts. Now, here's the bizarre thing. In this study that I mentioned, they also bought many thyroid support supplements that didn't list thyroid glandulars. They didn't say they had bovine, or I've even seen rabbit thyroid. They didn't say any of that. But of those products, 80% had random active thyroid hormone. They had thyroid glandulars in them, even though they didn't list them on the label. So that's why I worry about those things, because they've got ingredients they shouldn't have. And another reason I worry about that is most of those are bovine thyroid tissue, bovine meaning cow-based. So cow thyroid tissue, forgive the graphic nature of this, but when cows are slaughtered, there's a high impact steel device that clocks them in the back of the head, and brain tissue spreads all around. So bovine tissue that comes from anywhere in the head or neck pretty much has some brain tissue in that. And there is a risk for prion-based illness from taking those supplements orally. So prion-based illness, such as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also called mad cow disease in cows, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome in humans. And that's a bad deal. That's something to where you may take a pill that has this stuff, you might feel fine for 15 years, and then your brain literally rots. I can't exaggerate the severity or the awfulness of that. So I would never risk taking a supplement that has bovine glandulars in there, cow brain stuff. That's just not safe anymore. So good reasons to avoid that. And the question is about ashwagandha. So there are things saying ashwagandha is unsafe if you've got Hashimoto's. What they're basing that on was an animal study showing that ashwagandha may heighten T4 to T3 conversion. And the thought process was that someone who's hypothyroid and on medication, in theory, if they started converting a lot more of it, it might be too much for them. So that was the rationale behind that. But that study was followed up on by watching some human outcome trials. Really, no big effects were noted. So ashwagandha, not a bad thing by any means. It's been called Indian, as in India, ginseng. And it has some generalized tonic properties without being a stimulant. So it's kind of a cool thing, but it won't do anything radically good or bad for your thyroid. None of the thyroid specific formula products have it because there's just no quality human studies attesting that it will do anything useful for the thyroid. It's not bad, but my mind process in making them, my thought process was I wanted to just do the stuff that was the cream of the crop and not throw 50 things in there. The more ingredients you've got in there, the weaker it all becomes because the less you've got of the important stuff. So yeah, I did leave out ashwagandha just because there was no good data showing that it did much that way. And I saw one more that I wanted to get. Okay. Yeah, Todd, here's a great thing that I've talked about a bit before as well. I read that 50% of people with autoimmune gastritis have Hashimoto's. Is that true? Todd, I honestly don't know that number, but I know the opposite number, meaning what percent of those with Hashimoto's have autoimmune gastritis, and that's around 30 to 40%. So yeah, if someone has Hashimoto's, they've got about a 30 to 40% risk of having autoimmune gastritis. I I think I have before heard what you're saying is what is the risk the other direction of those that have autoimmune gastritis? How many have Hashimoto's? I don't think it's that high. If I were doing a multiple choice test, I wouldn't choose 50% on that test, but possibly. But I do know that the other direction, it's just about that much. And that's super relevant. So many people that have thyroid disease, especially when we talk about low iron, they'll try to build it up. They struggle, it won't come up because they have a hard time absorbing it from autoimmune gastritis, aka thyrogastric syndrome is what they call that. Here's one that I want to address because this is a real big point of confusion amongst a lot of doctors. Oh, I'm seeing a lot of good questions. I better grab a couple of these. Vivian, I see. Here we go. Vivian, how do we order proper supplement packages in the midst of testing revealing new diagnoses? Latest test that is SIBO, osteoporosis, solid nodule, ACTH, weight of range, apnea, several more. Should I wait until testing is complete? Vivian, great question. If you are in the midst of sorting a lot of things out in terms of what your condition is, you can always wait, of course. The main thing, though, is that these are really focused on thyroid specific concerns. So if you have other conditions to treat, you would still treat them as you would. And the other part of my thought process was I didn't want to put a lot of random ingredients that weren't important so they wouldn't have to get in the way of your other treatments and become too redundant. So yeah, you can target the thyroid concerns as you are doing other treatments and other diagnoses without there being real issues that way. So several good questions I'm picking and choosing. Let's see. Let me get something to clarify. So I saw this same question, almost the same question worded in a different way. How can I be sure I'm getting enough iodine? I'm assuming I am on your reset plan, eating only green light foods. I eat mostly whole food vegetables. How can I make sure lack of iodine will not hurt me? So Paul, thank you for that. Paul, if you'd like to mention your situation, if you're on thyroid medication or not, and let's give you a good answer though. So the World Health Organization has tracked the different levels at which people have complications from different amounts of iodine and different age groups as well. So children, when they're below 20 micrograms per day, they have a very high rate of cretinism and endemic goiter. And those are serious things. They're a real problem. Those have not occurred on planet Earth since 1990. So about 93 was the last time that happened anywhere on the planet. No exaggeration. Before then, that was in the 60s. The 93 was one province in China. The 60, I forgot the exact year, but that was in a part of New Guinea. So these things don't happen anymore. Now, adults, if they are below 20 micrograms of iodine per day, that doesn't happen. There's been no populations at that level. So they could theoretically have problems, but we honestly don't know. When adults are between 20 and 50 micrograms per day, that's categorized as mild iodine insufficiency. Now, the bizarre thing is that as adults, they have amongst the lowest rates of autoimmune thyroid disease when they're at mild iodine insufficiency. So there's been talk about changing those labels. Between 50 and 50 to 199 micrograms per day is considered iodine sufficiency. And there's still low rates of adult disease, but it's a little lower at that mild insufficiency range. So, Paul, if your diet has a fair amount of different food categories recommended, I'm sorry, I'm seeing more of your comments here. So you are on a prescription, 66 years old, 75 milligrams of T4. So, Paul, here's my pet peeve. If you told a pharmacist 75 milligrams and they made that, it would be lethal. It's micrograms. and you're forgiven because that mistake would never translate into it. But I actually have seen cases where medical people goof that up. And so it's made it a pet peeve of mine. So you need a C between your M and your G to keep you safe. So you're on 75 micrograms of T4. Now that 75 micrograms of T4 is about 65% iodine by molar mass. So you're getting iodine in that as well. And you're getting roughly about what, like 30 micrograms or more just from that. Now, when you're taking thyroid medication, your body is relying upon that for a certain fraction of the hormone production you would normally do, right? So, what you would do with iodine, you're already doing part of that with the medication. Now, in your diet, let's say you're on a plant based diet and you're having some grains, some beans as well, and a good variety of foods, you will probably fall around the 30 to 70 micrograms of iodine per day from your diet. So, plus what you've got in your medication, you'll probably be in the 60 to 100 microgram per day range. You're fine. You're totally fine. There's no worries about that. Adults on thyroid medication honestly do not get iodine deficiency. There's a whole nother discussion about iodine tests and why sometimes they can be misled to think that, but no, that's not a concern of yours. And not only that, but it sounds like you're on a healthy diet and doing some good stuff. Uh, Keep tabs on your needs for medication. Paul, I've written some good papers, and I'll put this up in the comments that talk about the process of de-prescribing. Many people doing what you're doing need to take less thyroid hormone. Their body gets better. The dose you're on would rarely be a dose that was a full replacement dose. It's one that would be a fraction of what your body would need. So what that tells me is you're likely still making a certain amount of thyroid hormone. And as such, I'm sorry, I'm pulling up this link here at the same time. And as such, you've got a good chance of that increasing over time. So, Paul, here's for you and for everyone else that's concerned about how their needs might change. Yeah, you might need less. And I just put a link up here, a very detailed article I wrote about de-prescribing safely. Here's how you know when you need less. Here's how you work with your doctor. Here's what that process would look like to taper. But somewhere around the study that I cited, somewhere around 80% of people who do even basic iodine reduction steps, they need less medication. And somewhere around 40% need none. Now, that's not true for those who lack a thyroid. And it's not true for those who need doses that are far above their body's needs. But for those that have a thyroid and are on smaller doses, that can totally apply to you. So check that out, Paul, and hope you find that very useful. And forgive me for teasing you about the C and the MCG, but just want you to stay safe. All right, let me grab, how are we doing on time here? Let me grab one or two more. You guys, really good conversations here and great questions and comments. Oh, here's a cool one. So thank you, Dr. C. Look forward to reading more about your work, hearing you speak with Maggie on osteobone health. My concern is taking levothyroxine 50 for thyroid severe osteoporosis. So Lorraine, yeah, awesome question. So I just did a fun summit that's coming out right now about bone health. Really good guest that had me, Margie. And thyroid medications have a warning label about causing dangers for those with osteoporosis. And it's good to have that there. It's good to think about it, but I think it generates a little more worry than it needs to. And here's what I mean by that, Lorraine. So if here's what your body needs for thyroid hormones, right? If you're somewhere up here, it's a huge risk for osteoporosis. And I'll touch on that tomorrow. So tomorrow the topic is about hyperthyroidism. And there's stages of hyperthyroidism. The first stage is where the TSH gets below range, even incrementally. And the T3, T4, they might be normal. They might even be low, believe it or not. But stage 1 hyperthyroidism is a TSH somewhere below 0.4. It could be 0.3, 0.2. And T3, T4 could be normal, maybe even low. Maybe there's no symptoms. That's called subclinical hyperthyroidism. And at that point, it does start to generate risks for the bones. And the reason for that is because the TSH, it tells your thyroid to work, but it also tells your bones to grow. So when the TSH is too low, the bones lose one of many important signals that keeps them working properly. So that's the connection. Now, how does that apply to those who are taking thyroid medication? Well, if you're taking the amount that your body needs and you're not in a hyperthyroid state, it doesn't apply to you at all. So if you're on a reasonable amount of the medication, that medicine is not going to hurt your bones. But if you're on an excessive amount, then that's a different story. Or if you're someone whose body makes too much, same thing, then we do have risks for bone thinning. So I see a fascinating follow-up comment from from you, Lorraine, here, saying that you're so I am hypothyroid and hyperparathyroid. Okay, so you're I'm assuming hypothyroid, but I want you to correct me if I'm wrong because you just said hypothyroid, and it could possibly say hyper in there. So if you wouldn't mind clarifying for me. Now you said you're hyperparathyroid. I'll talk about that, and I'll watch for you to clarify the hypothyroid. Okay, got it. Okay, let's talk about that. So you're hypothyroid. I'm assuming that your thyroid dose has you in the ballpark, that it's not far more than you need. If that's true, your levothyroxine is not hurting your bones. Now, the hyperparathyroidism, that is hurting the bones. So hyperparathyroidism means there's an excess of parathyroid hormone. And what parathyroid hormone does is it draws calcium out of your stores, which is the gut lining and also the bones, and into your bloodstream, and then eventually out into your urine. So, being hyperparathyroid, that's a big deal for your bones, and you do want to diagnose and treat that. Now, hyperparathyroidism is almost always primary hyperparathyroidism, meaning that one of these, usually four glands, just went rogue. There's a feedback signal that allows the glands to figure out how much you need and to make that much and then adjust. Sometimes there's a short circuit in the doorbell and the poor gland just cranks out too much parathyroid hormone. And yeah, that does require treatment. Uh, this is something to where, Lorraine, there's been a group that's really been like the national leaders on managing and treating parathyroid disease. They're called the Norman Parathyroid Center. They've got a location in Florida. They've got a couple of more throughout the country. But if my wife, I've had tons of patients I've sent there. If my wife had it, if I had it, I would have them take care of it. In the hands of someone who does a lot of good volume on parathyroid surgery, you're in and out in 20 minutes and you're fine and it's life-changing. It's incredibly important. So yeah, consider the Norman Center, but do address that. I see many people to where they have undiagnosed hypercalcemia or untreated hyperparathyroidism. Doctors say, oh, it's not that bad. You can wait. It's bad. It causes more than you would think in terms of symptoms and risks. So I would certainly speak with your team and address the parathyroid disease. That's a big, big factor. Okay. Yeah, so a couple of related questions. Shanna Hopkins, so you wouldn't feel safe in eating beef cheeks or beef tongue. Those are frequent foods and muscle meats, but from the head region. Shanna, I would go to my way to avoid those. I really would. And in the big scheme of things, I'm sure there's less risk from, parts like that than it would be from parts within the brain. But I have read papers about prion contamination throughout this whole area. And there was a paper about a person developing a prion-based illness that was thought to be traced to glandular supplements that include cows' tissues like that. So I would avoid that. That's the thing about prion-based diseases is that you can't screen for them and you can't detect them until they're like so far gone you can do nothing about it. And they can be latent for a decade or longer. So they freak me out. Lorraine, so you agree surgery? I read about them. Thank you. Yeah, Lorraine, there's nothing else to do other than taking the one. It's almost always one, sometimes more than one. But yeah, in the hands of a good surgeon, it's a very straightforward thing and it's life-changing. Lorraine, I've got a very detailed post about parathyroid disease and the many symptoms it can cause and the health risks. If you've not seen that, please just Google my name and parathyroid and you'll find that. One or two related. So Melissa, you mentioned about autoimmune gastritis. Do you then recommend biotics/digestive enzymes to help combat the absorptive rates? Melissa, I've not seen data suggesting that those things help. The problem is that there's a loss of parietal cell function. It's not a lack of enzymes. In theory, high amounts of hydrochloric acid might help someone with autoimmune gastritis absorb their nutrients. But I don't recommend that. The reason is when their parietal cell function is compromised, they can't make stomach acid, but they also can't make mucin, which protects the stomach against acid. And the biggest complication of autoimmune gastritis is development of esophageal cancer or stomach cancer. So if you could pour in a bunch of hydrochloric acid, you might take care of one part of the problem, meaning that there's not making HCl, but you would make things worse because they can't protect themselves against any HCl. So, and yeah, it's not a lack of enzymes. So I don't think that would help, but HCl might help, but it probably would worsen the risks. So we have to think about that from both ways. Okay, you guys, I'm seeing a lot of really cool questions here, and I'm not going to get to every one of these tonight. I'm sorry. I can see that already. Let me scroll through and grab one or two more. Um, hmm. Yeah, several good ones. I was trying to choose. Let me just grab a couple that are visible. Okay, so Cindy, does a low TSH on levo cause vision issues? I have bad sensitivities to indoor lights. Lights look darker than they are, bother my eyes. Fine outside. Ophthalmology says my eyes are fine. So, Cindy, it's possible. So, low TSH. And Cindy, if you want to clarify that for that better for me, I'd be happy to look and see what you mean. By low TSH, do you mean below range? And the answer I'll give is assuming that you mean TSH is below range. In that case, it is possible. So hyperthyroidism can affect vision in several ways. One of the most worrisome is the development of Graves' eye disease. And your ophthalmologist said your eyes are fine, you wouldn't have active Graves' eye disease. That's a good thing. At the earliest stages of Graves' eye disease, there may not be visual signs that the ophthalmologist can see, but there can be changes in symptoms. Okay, so 0.04. So your TSH is well below range. It's almost completely suppressed. So the thought process is, should you change that? And it's possible that could be affecting your vision. Even if it's not, it is having a negative impact on your health in other ways. And you should change that. So yeah, Cindy, my topic for tonight's talk is all about the relevance of hyperthyroidism and how that affects one's health. But that can be a factor for your vision. And yeah, this is stage 1 hyperthyroidism. And I do see doctors who will say that, it's okay if the TSH is only a little bit low, or it's okay if the T3 is not yet up, or if the T4 is not elevated. There's still risks. We still see risks towards Graves' eye disease, bone thinning, cardiovascular disease, brain aging, early risk of total mortality. So it's not good for you in any of those events. So I would encourage changing that. Let's take a look. Here's a great one. I'll grab this one and one more. New supplements has 30 of biotin, but Hashimoto's Guide, older book, mentioned 300. A reason for this to be lower than what you recommended previously. So yes, and I've come to realize we understand what happens every couple of years with your phone. They make a better version, right? And I just went through this. I had to get something for our office. They needed to have a mobile hotspot. And so I'm on the phone with Verizon, getting them this thing for the office. And they're saying, you've got a lot, you're on an old account, your phones are due for upgrades. It would actually be cheaper for you to upgrade your phones. I'm like, all right, well, go ahead if it's cheaper. I don't really care otherwise. But so I got a new phone. Now, doesn't mean my old phone was bad. Doesn't mean my old phone was wrong, but they make these things better and they update the software as well. Every so often you get a software update. And that's how I think about the supplementation. So the data on biotin requirements has changed, both in terms of how much is helpful and how much might start skewing laboratory tests. So 30 micrograms per our most current data is more than enough for all purposes of biotin requirements. The idea of B vitamins way above RDA has been starting to fall more and more out of favor, especially in the context of autoimmune disease. And I really wanted to lead the discussion on that. We need these things, they're important, but when they're in amounts that are far above what we get in food, they act in ways that are not the same as what food would do. So one change also with the new supplements is that I'm moving away from higher dose B vitamins down towards more physiologic requirements. Biotin itself, we need some, and 30 micrograms is helpful. It's more than enough to make up for any of those that are lacking in that. And somewhere around, to my last study that I read, somewhere around 20% of women that have varying types of alopecia, more totalis or more just even and diffuse hair loss, somewhere around 20% can be low in biotin. And for getting back to biotin sufficiency, at least 10 micrograms is required. 30 can certainly do the job. 300 can work, but it's overkill. And I'm moving away from that approach. biotin does also disrupt laboratory markers. There's a list of about 300 different lab tests that are abnormal if one is consuming biotin within the few days prior to that. And conceptually, I just feel more comfortable with things when they're in a range of what we find in food, unless there's a very targeted reason otherwise. So that was my thought process on that one. And I saw one last one that I wanted to address quickly. Do you have patients that fully recover from Hashimoto's? Another one from Todd. I think is going to round our discussion out. For sure, by fully recover. Okay, so people use that in two different ways. Some talk about that meaning they feel as good as they did before they got sick. Others talk about, I guess, more than two ways. Some talk about that meaning their antibody levels went down. And others talk about that meaning that they no longer need thyroid medication and they feel fine. So I guess those are three ways I hear people talk about what does recovery mean. And by any of those definitions, for sure, that happens. The study that I mentioned before, the one on deprescribing, it showed that most people, not most, but many people on thyroid medication, even if they don't do anything special, if they just taper, about a third don't need it. About a third lose nothing by being off of it. So then the question is, at what point does Hashimoto's benefit from thyroid medication? In many cases, it doesn't. In many cases, there's just no benefit to the overall autoimmune process or the disease progression or the level of symptomology. It's often not helpful. So it can be, but it's not always. So yes, people definitely can recover. And actually, Todd, there was a study that I cited in the thyroid reset diet in which people with Hashimoto's were put on a low iodine diet. And within 3 months, 78% had perfectly normal thyroid function. I see similar numbers. We had someone just a few weeks ago who had a TSH of 16. They went on the thyroid reset diet. It now normalized and their antibody levels reversed. So it happens. Yep. Now, the three ways of getting better, the one about feeling as well as you did before diagnosis, I would argue that's always on the table. And you should settle for nothing less than that. You should never say, well, I'm mostly better, but I guess this is as good as it gets. No, you should never, that's not good enough. You should always assume that you could feel at least as well as you did before this diagnosis came about. If you have a thyroid and you don't need a dose of medication that's more than your thyroid would make, there's also a very good chance that you can make more. Your thyroid can function better again. The studies on the iodine reduction diet showed that people that did follow the diet and were compliant, 97% needed less medication or no medication. So most people can get better and anyone can feel better, anyone can function better, and most can need less medication. So yeah, the chance of really getting cured or recovering are very, very high. Ascetic Love, you're totally welcome for the clarification. Hope that was useful. And I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Yep. Okay, so we've got the event tomorrow night. I'm going to pop back on in just a moment, make sure we've got links for you guys for that. And this will be the webinar series. Tomorrow is going to be on hyperthyroidism. So those that are on a higher dose of medication, like Cindy mentioned with her TSH of 0.04, we'll talk about that. Also Graves' disease, toxic nodular goiter, and how to strategies, how to think about them, the risks of them, and also at what point micronutrients and supplements can be useful and how that would fit in one's overall plans. So that'll be tomorrow night. I'll get that link up. And yeah, hope to see you guys then. In the meantime, take great care. We'll talk again really soon. Bye-bye.